Imagine lying flat in the mud, completely still, holding your breath, while nearly 200 enemy soldiers move through the darkness just yards away from your position, and the entire plan depends on not a single man making a sound until the exact right moment. This is not fiction. This happened on the island of Guadalcanal in the sweltering jungles of the Solomon Islands, in the dead of night on October 26, 1942, during one of the most ferocious and psychologically brutal campaigns of the entire Pacific War. What unfolded in those 3 hours of absolute darkness was not just a military engagement. It was a masterclass in human nerve, tactical genius, and the terrifying cost of underestimating a prepared enemy. One Marine, surrounded by exhausted men who hadn't slept properly in days, looked out into the black jungle and decided that the best weapon he had was patience. His name was Mitchell Red Mike Page, a sergeant from Charleroi, Pennsylvania, and what he did that night would earn him the Medal of Honor and cement his place among the most decorated combat Marines in American history. But this story is bigger than one man. It is the story of a turning point that the world almost missed, fought in a place most people couldn't find on a map, decided by decisions made in seconds, under fire, in the rain, in the dark. If this kind of story moves you, the kind where real human beings face impossible odds and somehow find a way to endure, then subscribe to this channel right now, hit the like button, and share this video with someone who loves history. Drop a comment below and tell us, did you already know who Mitchell Page was before watching this? Because most people don't, and that is exactly why this story needs to be told. To understand what happened that October night, you need to go back several months earlier and understand why Guadalcanal mattered so much that both sides were willing to bleed for it without limit. In early 1942, Japan was expanding across the Pacific with a speed and violence that shocked the Allied world. They had taken the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and were pushing further south toward Australia. When Japanese engineers began constructing an airfield on the island of Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942, American military planners understood immediately what it meant. A completed airfield there would give Japan the ability to cut off supply lines between the United States and Australia, potentially isolating the entire Southwest Pacific theater. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander Vandegrift landed on Guadalcanal in the first major American offensive ground operation of the war. They seized the unfinished airfield and renamed it Henderson Field, in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. What nobody fully anticipated was how ferociously Japan would fight to take it back, and what that ferocity would demand from every single Marine ordered to defend it. The weeks following the initial landing were a descent into a kind of hell that few military campaigns in history have matched for sheer sustained misery. The Marines on Guadalcanal faced not just the Japanese Imperial Army but the island itself. The relentless tropical heat, diseases like malaria and dysentery that swept through the ranks with merciless efficiency, the constant rain that turned every trail into a river of mud, and the psychological terror of an enemy that attacked almost exclusively at night, using the jungle as cover, screaming and firing in waves designed to shatter nerves as much as bodies. Japanese commanders, deeply underestimating American resolve, sent units piecemeal onto the island rather than in overwhelming force, convinced that the Marines would break quickly. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki led the first of these attacks on August 21, 1942, at the Tenaru River, and his force of around 900 men was virtually annihilated by Marine defenders in what became one of the most lopsided American victories of the early Pacific campaign. But Japan did not stop. They sent more men, more ships, more aircraft, and the grinding battle for Henderson Field became an obsession for Imperial Japanese High Command, a matter of national honor and strategic necessity that they simply could not afford to lose. By late October 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal had reached a critical inflection point. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had coordinated a massive operation involving naval forces, air forces, and ground troops all converging simultaneously to retake Henderson Field in what Imperial planners expected to be a decisive, coordinated knockout blow. Lieutenant General Harakichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese ground forces on the island, and his plan called for multiple simultaneous assaults on the Marine perimeter from different directions, designed to overwhelm defenders who were already stretched thin, undersupplied, and weakened by weeks of illness and combat. The main assault would come from the south, through dense jungle terrain that Japanese planners believed the Marines had not fully defended. a ridge system that would later be named Hannikin's Ridge and, more famously, Chesty-Puller's sector along what became known as the Matanika Line. The Japanese were committing thousands of men to this assault. The Marines defending the southern perimeter that night were far fewer, armed with machine guns, rifles, and the knowledge that if Henderson Field fell, the entire campaign, and possibly the strategic balance of the Pacific War, could shift irreversibly in Japan's favor. Mitchell Page was 22 years old when he took command of his machine gun platoon along the southern ridge on the night of October 25, going into October 26, 1942. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps at 17, had trained hard, studied weapons with the obsessive devotion of a man who understood that the machine gun was not just a weapon but an instrument of geometry, angles of fire, interlocking fields, the precise positioning of barrels that could mean the difference between holding a line and losing it entirely. Page positioned his guns carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire that would channel any attacking force into kill zones, where defenders could concentrate firepower from multiple directions simultaneously. This was the trap. It required patience. Absolute iron patience, because the worst thing a machine gunner can do is open fire too early, revealing his position before the enemy is fully committed to the attack and giving them the chance to scatter back into the jungle. Page briefed his men quietly, calmly, telling them to hold fire until he gave the command, no matter what they heard or saw in the darkness ahead. Some of those men were teenagers. All of them were exhausted, and the jungle in front of them was completely silent in a way that felt deeply, unmistakably wrong. Shortly after midnight on October 26th, the silence broke. Approximately 180 Japanese soldiers from the crack Sendai Division, battle-hardened veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, burst from the jungle in a screaming, full-speed charge directly into Page's position. The noise was overwhelming: gunfire, grenades, shouted orders in Japanese, the crashing of men running through undergrowth, and beneath it all, the disciplined, terrible patience of Page's Marines, who held their fire for what must have felt like an eternity. Then Page gave the order, and the machine guns opened up simultaneously, and the effect was catastrophic for the attackers. Men fell in waves. The Japanese, trained to press through initial fire and close to hand-to-hand range, kept coming, because that is what they were trained to do, because stopping meant dying in the open, because their commanders had told them the Marines would break. They did not break. But the cost on the American side was terrible too. One by one, in the chaos of that thundering darkness, Page's gunners were hit, killed, or wounded, until he found himself moving from gun to gun, firing each weapon himself, running through enemy fire in the dark to keep all positions active so that the Japanese could not identify and exploit any gap in the line. What happened in those 3 hours defies easy description, because it exists at the boundary of what human beings are physically and psychologically capable of sustaining. Mitchell Page was hit by shrapnel and kept firing. He moved through a gauntlet of grenades and kept firing. He reached positions where his fellow Marines lay dead or dying, took control of their weapons, and kept those guns roaring without pause because he understood, with perfect, cold clarity, that the moment those guns fell silent, the Japanese would surge through the gap and Henderson Field would be exposed. At one point, according to his own later account and the testimony of survivors, Page picked up a fully loaded Browning M1917 machine gun, a weapon that weighed approximately 105 pounds with its water-cooling jacket, and carried it forward, firing from the hip, advancing into the Japanese line rather than retreating. This was not recklessness. It was a calculated shock action, designed to disrupt the cohesion of an attacking force that had been trained to press against a static defensive line. It worked. The Japanese assault began to falter, then fragment, then collapse, as the men who had survived the initial carnage encountered this single figure advancing through the smoke and fire, apparently unstoppable, apparently alone, apparently willing to walk directly into them without hesitation. By the time dawn broke over the ridge on October 26, 1942, the ground in front of Page's position told the story in the only language that battle leaves behind. 67 Japanese soldiers lay dead in the kill zones he had prepared and defended through the night. The Sendai Division's assault had been shattered not by superior numbers, not by air support, not by artillery, but by the tactical preparation of one Marine sergeant, the discipline of the men he had trained, and the refusal to yield a single yard of ground even after everything around him had collapsed. Page was not the only hero of that night along the Guadalcanal perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty-Puller, already legendary among Marines, had held his sector against equally ferocious attacks, and the combined resistance of the Marine defenders across the ridge system effectively broke the back of Japan's Grand October offensive to retake Henderson Field. Yamamoto's coordinated assault had failed. The airfield held. And with it, the momentum of the Pacific War began. Slowly, painfully, at enormous cost, to shift in a direction from which Japan would never fully recover. The Battle of Guadalcanal officially ended on February 9, 1943, when Japan completed a secret nighttime evacuation of its remaining forces from the island, an operation American commanders initially mistook for a new landing. In total, roughly 7,000 Americans died in the Guadalcanal campaign, from combat, disease, and the naval battles that raged offshore in the waters that sailors would come to call Iron Bottom Sound, for the dozens of ships, American and Japanese, that rest on its floor to this day. Japanese losses were catastrophically higher. Estimates range from 20 to 30,000 dead, with disease and starvation claiming nearly as many lives as American firepower. The island campaign consumed the elite of Japan's naval air power in a series of brutal aerial engagements, losses from which the Imperial Japanese Navy never recovered. Mitchell Page received the Medal of Honor from President Franklin D. Roosevelt on May 21, 1943, at a ceremony that recognized not just one night of extraordinary action but the broader truth that battles are won by individuals who refuse, at the critical moment, to accept defeat as inevitable. Page lived until 2003, spending decades speaking to veterans groups, schools, and military organizations about the meaning of duty, sacrifice, and the weight that every generation carries for the freedoms it inherits from those who bled before them. History is full of battles that changed the world, but the ones that matter most are often the ones fought by people whose names never made the headlines. Men who held a ridge in the dark, who fired their last rounds into the smoke, who carried impossible weights forward when every rational instinct said to fall back. The story of Mitchell Page and the night of October 26, 1942, is not just a military story. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when they decide that something matters enough to die for, and more remarkably, to live for, to carry forward, to remember. Guadalcanal is a remote island in the South Pacific. Most of the men who fought there are gone now. The jungle has reclaimed much of what they built and bled over. But in the soil of that island, and in the record of what happened on that ridge in those 3 terrible hours, there is something that deserves to be preserved, not as nostalgia, not as glorification of violence, but as testimony to the human capacity for courage under conditions that most of us will never face and can barely imagine. If the story meant something to you, if it gave you something to think about, something you didn't know before, then please subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below and tell us what surprised you most about this story, because the best way to honor these men is to make sure their story keeps being told, keeps reaching new people, keeps reminding us what the word sacrifice actually means.